Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning everybody. This is my task and also my great pleasure to open the second day of the Myths, Memories and Economies conference. And at the same time, it's my task to chair the third panel of the conference, Memory and Agency. We have three distinguished scholars. As you know from the program, they will speak about the post-89 or post-communist transformation in different Central and East South European countries. We have, I guess, something more than 90 minutes, but anyway, I will ask you not to speak more than at maximum 20 minutes. The discussion will follow after the three talks. And so all of them will speak about the transformation, but according to my knowledge, they have used different methods and they will focus on different issues of transformation. So I guess it will be a very interesting session. So the first one is Veronika Pehe. Veronika Pehe is Marie Curie Fellow at the Institute of Contemporary History in Prague, so my institute. She studied and she completed her PhD at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies in London, and currently her research focuses, as you can imagine, on the contemporary history of Central Europe, but especially on the intersection of memory, culture, and politics, and something like this will be also the topic of her paper. So the title of Veronika Pehe's paper is Let's Start a Business, the Memory of Entrepreneurship and the Czech Student Generation of 1989. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I mainly work on representations and film, actually, but today I'm going to talk about something quite different, because for the past 3 years I've also been involved in a large oral history project at the Institute of Contemporary History in Prague. And I'll tell you a bit more about this project in a second, but I'd just like to start with a quote. So I really liked it in the 90s in that we really had freedom and we knew, or at least I felt that if I tried to do something, nobody was going to throw a spanner in the works and I would get somewhere. And it's my thing, my choice, what I want to do, yeah? No rules are going to get dictated to me. So this is a teacher and businessman from a city in Western Bohemia. So in this extract, Jiří Sojka recalls his memories of the 1990s. An overly positive, at times even nostalgic image of this decade emerged strongly as a spontaneous motif in the oral history project, The Student Generation of 1989 in Longitudinal Perspective, Biographical Interviews After 20 Years, which was conducted between 2017-2019 at my institute. This project was actually a follow-up to a previous project conducted 20 years ago, and you can see on the left-hand side the publication that resulted from this original project in 1999, which was called 100 Student Revolutions, it was the result of interviews with 100 former students who had taken part in the events of November 1989 in Czechoslovakia, specifically the student strikes, which then led to a number of other events that eventually brought down the communist regime. And now, 20 years later, a new research team led by the same principal investigator has returned to this same the same 100 narrators to see how their memory, their perceptions of 1989 have changed. So actually the main focus of this project was not the 1990s and the transformation at all. Our aim was to see how changes in individual and collective memory of the Velvet Revolution have been formed and simultaneously also absorbed by this group, because this group was also quite a specific group of people who went on to take up quite prominent public positions. I'll talk about that a bit more as to why that was. So they were very much part of the kind of elite who was also forming the discourse on 1989 and the memory of 1989 in the Czech Republic in the years that followed. But actually, speaking to them, and we conducted these interviews through the method of oral history, asking the respondents to recount their life stories since 1989, so basically what they've done until the present. It turned out that the 1990s were really a kind of major focus of memory for them. And it also was clear that the 1990s are a historical period for them. It's no longer part of the present. So they are able to historicize this decade and look back upon it in retrospect. And it turns out that they definitely have a very strong emotional investment in this period. So the respondents represent students from all the former university towns in the Czech part of the country. And as I mentioned, a number of them, oh, sorry, that's the previous slide. A number of them went on to become public figures. I mean, these photos probably don't mean that much to you, but as you can see from the photos, these are all kind of taken in official circumstances. So these are people who have achieved some kind of positions of success. They were people who entered the new political regime with high levels of social and cultural capital, either as university students or fresh graduates, and they thus entered the workforce in the wake of the systemic transformation and were in an excellent social position to take advantage of the new opportunities offered by the free market. And for this reason, the memory of entrepreneurship and business practices in the 1990s was a very frequent topic of the interviews, and it's this that I will focus on today. And this topic certainly played into a nostalgically laden image of the, so to say, golden 90s amongst the interviewees, as the popular designation in Czech goes. And when asked how he would describe the atmosphere of entrepreneurship during this decade, cultural manager Vlastimil Ježek told me it was one big party. So before moving towards the analysis of the given topic, I'll just tell you very briefly something about the methodology. 2 interviews were conducted with each respondent. In the first biographical interview, they spoke freely about their life story. And in the second follow-up interview, which was semi-structured, they were asked more specific questions which the research team had put together as a result of these initial first interviews, so that we could focus more on the key topics that had come up. So given their advantageous starting position, this group of former students generally achieved success in their careers, and they narrate their life stories and their memories of the 1990s from the position of what is generally called the winners of the transformation. And in this sense, the studied group are certainly not unique. The central term for this particular interpretation of post-89 history in the narrator's recollections is freedom. Among the various freedoms gained, the freedom of the market was seen by them as one of the foundational values of the new order. So here we have one of our narrators saying, probably the strongest value that accompanies it all is freedom of free movement, free thinking, expressing one's opinion, freedom to do business too, everything is connected. So setting up one's own business quickly became an aspiration for a large part of the population after 1989, not just these former students. And Czechoslovak citizens could begin to realize their entrepreneurial ambitions in 1990 with the passing of the Act on Private Enterprise. Further deregulation followed in 1991 in the process of so-called small-scale privatization, in which smaller state-owned enterprises were auctioned off to private owners. So we can speak of a situation in which freedom and freedom of the market became coterminous for many. And this is a rhetorical maneuver that not only the former students were susceptible to, but also, for instance, former dissidents. As for instance, dissident writer Martin Šimečka recalls in an essay published in 2014, I quote, "Our whole lives until that point had been dedicated to the defense of freedom, and we unconditionally believed in its effects on society. when the economists came and started talking about the free market, in our understanding, they were talking about freedom. End of quote. So here's another example from one of our narrators who now works in finance, and he testifies that setting up a business could take really very spontaneous forms in the 1990s. And he says, we thought he's talking about himself and a friend from university. Jesus, let's start a business. We didn't think about the fact we hadn't graduated, but thankfully we both finished university in the end. And so we had a bureau de change. We rented a kind of cupboard from our university. And he goes on to recount how in this cupboard they had this money exchange office and started earning money. But such an atmosphere where everything was possible did not last for long. And certainly many of the narrators commented on the differences between running a business in the 1990s and today, which nowadays they perceive the business environment to be much more regulated. So, for instance, this sound engineer and property developer told me, at that time, this path of a really open system where what wasn't forbidden was allowed, that was just great, yeah? Those were good times, and I think we really all felt, or not everyone, but people who had some kind of potential to take care of themselves felt that that's the way to just do business, earn one's own money, create positions for employees, and so on, to just go for it. And that was motivating. Today, it's rather the other way around, isn't it? Today, there are so many conditions and obstacles that everyone will think twice before setting up their own business. So many narrators valued the lack of regulation positively, noting that later on, during the course of the transformation, the state began intervening more into citizens' lives and set up clear rules. And while some of them continue to identify with such a libertarian ethos, which they now perceive as lacking, not all narrators saw the introduction of regulation negatively, but rather as something necessary that ensued after a period of uncontrolled freedom. So the positive memories of the 1990s displayed in the recorded interviews can rather be linked to what this narrator, Dobrovský, described as the potential for people to take care of themselves, or what he means personal agency and initiative. This whole sample group was initially defined by its anti-communist attitude by virtue of engaging in anti-regime activities in 1989 and taking an active public stance during the revolutionary days, despite coming from various social backgrounds. So these were people who certainly had a desire or disposition to be active, and after 1989, their anti-communist attitude tended to translate into what was seen as the direct opposite of communism by them: freedom of the market, individual responsibility, less state regulation, and so on. So basically, they were pretty happy with the course of the economic transformation. And for this reason, the motif of entrepreneurship is so significant, because this is the activity that both our narrators and scholars see as the essence of the new individualist value orientation after 1989. As sociologist Stanislav Holubec's analysis of the contemporary Czech press from the 1990s shows, entrepreneurs were portrayed by journalists as the real bearers of values in the 1990s, while popular mythology already began to connect the figure of the entrepreneur with the transformation's more nefarious side. This criticism of business people is, however, something that our respondents tried to distance themselves from, sometimes in quite emphatic terms. So here's one narrator saying, often business people were unjustly spoken about as caricatures, especially at the beginning of the 90s, with big mobile phones and purple blazers who built themselves those horizontal prefab blocks outside of Prague. Of course, there were a number of cases like that, but I think it was unjust. And this other woman says, it really torments me, because in other European countries, someone who is capable of making a living, feeding their family, providing jobs for employees, paying insurance for them, is an esteemed citizen. And here, they're basically a gangster. So our respondents demonstrated awareness of critical perspectives on some of the phenomena linked with the economic transformation, but this is something from which they attempted to rhetorically distance themselves. multiple narrators emphasized their own personal moral integrity. Even if they gradually became aware of the unsavory economic and political practices that came to dominate Czech politics, this was something that did not concern them personally. The entrepreneur, as a creator of values worthy of emulation, can be understood amongst this group as a realization of a certain social responsibility that many of them felt to be a result of their experience of November '89, when they took things into their own hands, as the ubiquitous transformation metaphor suggests. The interviews help us understand how a successful segment of the population narrate the values associated with the rise of capitalism. What is significant is that in the original interviews collected 20 years ago, the narrators did not actively criticize the collectivist ethos of the previous regime, nor did they reflect upon the new individualism of the 1990s. One respondent, who actively uses the language of individualism, personal choice, and responsibility today, in the 1990s only stated matter-of-factly that he set up a business, while today he's self-reflexive about his individualistic orientation during the early transformation years, and he has even undergone a kind of change of mind where he sees his behavior in the 90s as perhaps too individualistic and kind of not socially sensitive. The longitudinal dimension of the project allows us to trace changes in self-perceptions over time, and it is clear that between the first set of interviews in the late 90s and today, the narrators experience a certain value reorientation. We thus have to ask to what extent the individualistic ethos of enterprising self that emerged with the introduction of neoliberal capitalism in East Central Europe was assimilated by our narrators later, that they retrospectively set their memories, as narrated today, in a value framework that highlights the role, initiative, and responsibility of the individual in contemporary society to an extent that was not present in their recollections in the 1990s, or that they perhaps had not assimilated yet to such an extent. The largely positive, even euphoric narrative of individual success stories and personal enterprise was, however, dampened when narrators spoke about wider political and social developments towards the end of the 1990s, which were marked by an economic recession, a crisis within the ruling right-wing party, and eventually a parliamentary election where the right-wing party lost to the Social Democrats. And President Václav Havel famously described the atmosphere in society in 1997 as a foul or bad mood. How much time do I have left?
3 minutes.
5 minutes? Oh, 3 minutes. Okay,
maybe
so
4.
All right. In addition, at the time when the present round of interviews was recorded, the mainstream media had already taken on critique of the transformation as a major topic, with criticism focusing on features such as non-transparent privatization processes, clientelistic networks, and the export of profits abroad. So the narrators actively acknowledged and indeed felt the need to square or even defend their positive memories of the 90s with the realization that the same freedom that enabled their stories of personal success also contributed to large-scale political and social problems. As one journalist explained, one began to realize, unfortunately, mainly during large-scale privatization, that whole enterprises were being defrauded, the legal system wasn't working quickly enough, but these disappointments weren't big enough to re-examine my views. So these words illustrate a kind of tension between the public and the private in these oral histories. The narrator's subjective experience of the decade is positive, even rose-tinted, but with the benefit of hindsight and knowledge that they have today, and which wouldn't necessarily even have been available to them at the time, they're forced to put their personal experience into wider, shared collective frameworks of the transformation. And the problematic aspects of the transformation are only interpreted retrospectively with the availability of new vocabularies. As Vladimir Ježek told me, back then we didn't even know the word transparent. So the interviews illustrate a gap between individual and collective memory. The latter is only beginning to be formed as the 1990s increasingly become a subject of political discourse and public scrutiny. But the narrators demonstrate a certain tension in integrating their subjective emotional experience with more critical collective frameworks. While it was the abrupt change of the political, economic, and legal framework after 1989 that gave university students and fresh graduates at the time the opportunity to engage in entrepreneurial activities and realize goals that would not have been possible under state socialism, most narrators contrast the feelings of newly gained freedom and events in their private lives with wider political developments that eventually hampered them or led to a certain disappointment. So I'm just going to wrap up here and say that although there is by no means yet a consensus in the public sphere, in the Czech public sphere that is, that the 1990s are to be condemned as harshly as the communist era, clearly this period is seen as more and more problematic. The collected narratives suggested a need of these individuals to find kind of narrative mechanisms to integrate this problematic period into the continuity of their own biographies. As this was a time when they generally flourished in the realm of business, despite a social and political context, they are only, with the passage of time, beginning to acknowledge as worthy of condemnation. So the double image of the 1990s between euphoria and criticism oscillates between private and public memory, and is proof that the consensus about how to understand this decade and what its significance is for today's society is still an open question to which we are only now beginning to find answers. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. Perfectly in time. We will discuss it later. And now we will have Gazela Pudar Drasko from Belgrade. Gazela Pudar Drasko is a research fellow at the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory of the University of Belgrade, and she also has got all her academic titles from the University of Belgrade, but she was visiting fellow at the Center for Southeast European Studies in Graz, and she received a Civil Society Scholar Award for comparative research of conservative intellectuals in Serbia and Poland. And until today, she's making research and she writes on the similar topics, engagement of intellectuals, engagement of young people, about ideologies, particularly about nationalism. Now, Gazela Pudar Drasko will speak about post-socialist transformation in Serbia, critical perspective of intellectuals. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want in the beginning to say that actually what I'm going to present is just one part of my research, which I conducted actually 8 years ago, so in 2010, 2011. And now I'm working on comparative research with intellectuals, because I interviewed intellectuals back then who were close to the government, who were on positions and holding some prominent positions in the government or around the government, and now I'm trying to do the same with this government, so intellectuals who are surrounding somehow this government, but this is not going so easy. So I meant that I'm going to have results also of this part now, but I didn't manage to get many interviews so far, which is very interesting conclusion, I have to say, but from some perspective they are reluctant to give interviews to the person. I have to say this is maybe the reason, to the person who is working at the institute, who is considered in Serbia as left liberal. So this is maybe the part of their reluctance to talk to me about these issues, but I'm going to continue, so maybe until the end of the year I will have what I plan to have till this very moment. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the context of Serbian transformation, which is quite specific and different from usual post-communist transformation countries, but having in mind that Serbia undergone the period of sanctions, and also we were somehow part of this dissolution of Yugoslavia, which affected very much also the process of transformation. We actually call this process, this period of 90s, as a blocked post-socialist transformation, with two cycles of international sanctions imposed on the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which also included rapid decline of the industry and economy performances indicators in general. Economic transformation in Serbia actually began in early 90s, so before actually the war broke out, there were already some measures which were introduced in direction of opening the market and in general economy. And then nearly half of all former socially owned enterprises were privatized during this period. Further privatization was blocked actually when the war broke out until 2000 due to Yugoslav wars and economic sanctions which were imposed. But however, we also saw a growth of private sector even during this period. So during the 90s, during the sanctions period, approximately 200,000 private firms were being founded at the time. During those years, political elites coming from socialist period, we call them in our literature nomenclatura, I guess you are familiar with this concept, used the blockade to enable the mass conversion of public economic resources into their own private ownership of the economic material capital, which is something specific for actually Serbia. Slow growth of the capitalist economy initiated during the beginning of 90s, then accelerated in 2000s after establishing the new democratic government after October 2000 and changes which were happened back then in Serbia. Scholars point out that the political and economic changes significantly influence middle and higher class, which is visible in value orientation change from redistributive statism, which was dominant in the end of 80s, to market liberalism as ideology, which was dominating in the beginning of 2000s. However, the economic performance in Serbia was far from being satisfactory, and even today it's really far from being satisfactory. In 2015, Serbia's GDP was 1/3 below the level when it was in the 1989, and during the 90s, about 2/3 of the workers fictionally preserved their jobs, engaging parallel informal economy. So there was actually the parallel system where you were employed in the state companies, but you were not working in the state companies because they were not working during the blockade, and they were doing on their own and trying to manage their own lives in the informal economy market. Predominant state clientelism, which was developed in 1990s precisely due to the blockade and the conversion of this political capital into economic capital, transformed largely into political clientelism and recognition of the political parties as main channels of employment. Today, this is very dominant actually in Serbia, and the ruling party, Serbian Progressive Party, is perceived as the main channel of employment, and that you are not able to get any kind of job without being a member of a party. Even in the recent months, you are not able to get a job, but you need to actually enter the party in order to have a possibility to get the job. Serbia embarks on the path of definite trade liberalization and public enterprise restructuring and privatization since 2000. And there were 3 years of period during the government of Zoran Đinđić, who was actually killed in 2003, which were considered as the real actually period of market liberalization. Everything after that was compromised in a way, and I will explain how. Still, even during this period, many large companies remain state-owned. State reforms introduced over the past 17 years, so from 2000 actually led toward more precarious work arrangements with adoption of new labor law in 2014 as a peak of flexibility versus security of jobs. In 2015, private sector employees made almost 70% of the sector, while state sector employees made another 1/3 of the total workforce. Services are basically the main main sector of activity in Serbia, and they represent half of Serbia's GDP, employing almost 57% of the workforce. The problem with Serbian economy is actually that the ratio of economically active population comparing to inactive one stands at a level of 0.9, which is completely unsustainable, having in mind high and strong pressure on the budget and public spending. However, it is unlikely that the better situation can be expected in the future, having in mind that our population is aging very much, and we do not have inflow of the new citizens. Actually, our citizens are going away, and there is a huge, not only brain drain now, but population drain from Serbia, due to many circumstances, and maybe at this moment the least economic reasons, but more political reasons and lack of perspective they see in Serbia. In addition, and obviously without sustainable prospect, the economy in Serbia is oriented towards attracting investments, foreign investments, which are made primarily in labor-intensive industries, as high employment keeps wages low. In 2014, Serbia even advertised itself at CNN as a land of highly skilled but cheap labor. The amount of minimum monthly wage for 2019, in this very moment, it was raised actually 1 month ago, and net fee that a worker who is receiving minimal wage is receiving is actually 254 euros per month, which is very low income. There is a low proportion of highly developed areas of production in Serbia's economic structure, and processing raw materials is still leading the sector, which is completely unfriendly environment for any kind of bigger growth of Serbian economy. And this is very contradictory to the proclaimed strategy of ICT development by our government, which gains a prominent role in their narratives for the moment. And we also recently have appointed Minister for Innovation and Technological Development, but without any visible and clear measures that would support this kind of development. What is relevant for Serbia, and maybe I don't know the situation in other countries, but we have extremely weak trade unions which are politicized, and we have very high polarization among public and private sector workforces, where private sector is completely unprotected due to the new laws which were introduced, while public sector workforce is enjoying benefits, and basically they have much higher salaries than the average private worker. So if we start from the assumption that system transformation consists of three interconnected parallel processes, where we have liberalization and macroeconomic stabilization, first one, institution building a second one, and microeconomic restructuring as a third one, we actually can claim that Serbia never transformed to the post-socialist system, whatever post-socialist system could be. But the issues of institution building and microeconomic restructuring are very weak in Serbia, and we are facing for the moment not only with not building institutions, but also capturing and devastating institutions which we have, which are state captured basically. Attempts to correct the system with the partial introduction of market principles were unsuccessful from its beginning. The complete transformation was the only solution, but it was not desirable for Yugoslav political leaders during the 80s, making a fertile ground for shifting the focus from difficult but necessary transformation, obviously economic transformation, to the national issues that could be fruitfully exploited from their own political gains, as we saw. They were very much exploited also for initiating the war. A radical escalation of the conflict in Yugoslavia, followed by military intervention and war, led to isolation of newly formed Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which consisted of Serbia and Montenegro back then. And Serbia was isolated from global economic trends, which prevented the operation and the pressure of the various institutions that could contribute to transformation, and which actually played a role in other post-communist countries like IMF, European Bank, and the World Bank. Instead, Serbia was very much closed from the outside, and its economy suffered badly. Instead of forming the new economic elite, the ruling group, which I already named nomenclatura, in these circumstances developed specific channels of preserving the privileges they possessed, turning them into economic capital. The ruling group has been winning over the poorer segments of population with the stories of better tomorrow, propaganda, and some redistribution of income if things drastically worsen, which is also the case even now. Of course, this has been possible thanks to maintaining the control over large parts of the economy in their hands, translating the formerly socially owned companies to the state-owned under their control. In addition, this population shows the extremely actual pattern of relying on the state, Serbian population I mean, which is expected to solve the problems the citizens face. In many researches which I have been doing among the citizens and population in Serbia in general, this issue of expecting from the state to be a problem solver is very much present even today. So this kind actually, which you presented, of liberal spirit, where you go and you do on your own, is not really something which is present in Serbia and was never present in Serbia. So in the contrast to the vast majority of impoverished citizens in this period, there was enormous enrichment of a small group of people who enjoyed the support of authorities and had a way to prevent its interference. The control of the political elite over the economic resources helped them to remain in power and to easily come back after several years of oppositional status in 2008. Actually, after 8 years of the politics that was introducing, let's say, liberal measures, liberal market measures, we faced again in 2008 during the problems of forming the government, the issue that those who were in power in the 90s came back to the government. So this was actually something which helped them, resources which they had helped them to remain in power even after the changes. This controlled conversion is the basic result of this blocked transformation. However, Milošević regime until 2000 lost the support of its elites, members of establishment who have been able to convert the political and economic capital, as well as the so-called war entrepreneurs, or somebody who simply used the war circumstances in order to enrich themselves. And his regime had become an obstacle to further increase of the capital, which is one of the reasons why actually he fell in 2000 year. Therefore, the protests in 2000 significantly mobilized not only the members of the middle class who were usually protesting against Milošević during the 90s, in intelligentsia in general, but also emerging capitalist class that sided with the opposition for the first time in this decade, because obviously they were not satisfied with the conditions and not inability to actually grow their capital by trading with other countries, because we were still under the sanctions. After the 2000 in Serbia, the process of post-socialist transformation was unblocked, and so-called delayed transformation has started with a full blow. However, the strong ties between political and economic elites were preserved. The change in government has led to the opening of Serbia to the world, removing the image of the remaining bastion of authoritarianism in Europe, lifting of sanctions, the ownership transformation of enterprising, strengthening civil society, changes in institutional sphere mark the continuation of the post-socialist transformation after 1 decade of stagnation. These all were seen as the encouraging signs for the authorities in Serbia have turned to the democratic and liberal values. However, this process was disrupted by important factors that proved to still shape the fate of Serbian citizens, such as unresolved status of Kosovo and returning nationalistic rhetoric as its consequence. And actually, we were faced in 1 year, we were faced with 2 large events. One of them was hitting actually whole world. That was the world economic crisis in 2008, but in the same year, Kosovo declared independence from Serbia, which was heavily used in years after to actually hide economic problems of Serbia. And nowadays, Serbia can be best described as a country of political capitalism, system that is based on exploitation of irrational, politically created monopolies in the economy. Serbia today is on a periphery or semi-periphery with strong clientelism, corruption network, especially among bureaucrats and office holders, with the opportunities for non-market gain profit arising from the institutional vacuum in the long term. Actually, we are also facing at the moment with accusations that are coming from the opposition to the ruling party that very few people close to the president of Serbia and president of the party are actually having the whole economic power in Serbia, buying all the companies and making actually cartel, which is family-owned cartel. So, I mean, it's really a challenging period even now. The elimination of dominant discourse characterized by dosed nationalism with xenophobic and exclusionary content did not work as smoothly as it was expected after 2000, despite the pressure from abroad. Intellectual reflections and self-reflection on this period after 2000 point to a strong division of intellectuals in Serbia, accusing each other of exclusivity and dogmatism, and in general the absence of real dialogue, which would contribute to the corpus of knowledge about the events of Yugoslav, but also post-Yugoslav period. This was the main conclusion, basically, of the interviews which I was conducting in 2010-2011. One of the Serbian scholars, Mladen Lazić, claims that the October 2000 changes were held on the shoulders of the middle class that recruited among themselves, actually, the political elites for the new ranks. And after all these decades of destruction and devaluation of intellectual reputation, intellectuals actually regrouped themselves and formed new political elite. And many of the people who were leading Serbia after 2000 actually came from intellectual circles, and 3 of them actually worked at my institute before, during the 90s. Just to be very brief, intellectuals actually criticized their colleagues for corruption and lack of critical thinking, which is followed by expanding the convenient truth, which is not based on the facts. They almost all agree on this, despite their different positions. And they also point out that intellectuals in Serbia have poor quality of intellectual material, as they say, which is the result of collapse of the value system and ideological egalitarianism, or uravnilovka, as we could say, which means that the intellectual elite is unable to strongly enough formulate their own ideological principles, ideas, and activities, which would then infuse into political actions. And this was the case also. This was not the case actually during the 80s, where it was clear who is representing the ideology of socialist self-management society and those who were clearly in favor of changing the system toward liberal market liberalism and political also liberalism. Serbian scholars have pointed out that the middle class is significantly less supportive of our liberal values today, actually. And also, what is very important to notice is they are very less supportive to the liberal values in the area of economic regulation comparing to political areas. So, actually, in Serbia, also citizens, but also intellectual elite never actually advocated clearly for economic liberalism. They were always claiming rule of law, political freedom, freedom of speech, human rights, everything which is linked to the political liberalism. But economic liberalism was always some kind of, let's say, social liberalism, where the state has preserved control very much. And this is the key characteristic of the Serbian intellectuals during the late 2000s years. Also, progress of neoliberal concept, the lack of alternatives visible until the crisis in 2008, in the few years after its inception, favored actually this expansion of their self-perception of intellectual decline, so they were not invited somehow to channel some new vision or channel any kind of vision which is beyond this clearly liberal vision which was back then dominating, and also they are focusing very much on the national and identity issues and trying to hold these economic issues on the side, which is very much characteristic in general of Serbian discourse, public discourse in the past 20 years. So economic issues were hidden, they are on the side, while all these identity issues which are linked to the relations to Kosovo, which are linked to relations to neighboring countries like Croatia, for example, they are very much taking the attention not only of the political elites but also of intellectual elites that are trying to actually working together with political elites in producing the discourse of the anxiety of Serbian population, which is then hiding the real economic problems. And this is very, very visible also in their their answers back then. And I will conclude with all this. Today is a little bit different situation. I don't have findings, but I can say that intellectuals are actually again coming back to the scene as political actors, and in absence of proper opposition that could actually be able to draw support from the larger portion of the citizenry, intellectuals are perceived as the ones who are able to voice critical consideration of the society and the state. And this is something new for our society, and in let's say, past 12 months, we are faced with the situation that there is a strong pressure on university and academic elite, and this is also the reason, one of the reasons is because they are actually trying to step in and offer some alternative political solutions, which is then seen as a danger to the actual political elite, and this is where I will finish my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And our next and last speaker is Katarina Vanek. She is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology of Culture at the University of Łódź. She studied there, if I understand it correctly, but she gained her PhD at Otto von Guericke Universität in Magdeburg, and her research include biographical methods, European identity, collective memory, immigration, and intercultural communication, and many other very interesting issues. And today, Katarina Vanek will speak about biographical experiences of transformation in the cohort of born 1980 to 1990, a case analysis. So quite interesting that now we will focus on generation one generation younger than in the first talk. So please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think really that my presentation may be treated as as something that follows yours. So thank you very much. It was beautiful, I think we can say, because, I should add that I'm going to discuss data which were gathered within the project, which is called Experience of a Process of Transformation in Poland. And it's about comparative analysis based on biographical interviews, and we collect biographies of people born in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? So I think a lot what has been already said is very similar to our outcomes. Although I think the situation of these people who were born a decade later is slightly different, and that's why I'm going to focus on it. A lot has been said so far, even yesterday, and written about transformation in Europe and in Eastern Europe and in Poland. And people generally, or scholars, usually examine it from the macro level perspective. And I think there is a lack of that perspective taken from the bottom, and I would like to do it today, focusing on one case. I would like to refer to one of very prominent Polish scholars who comes from my university, Andrzej Piotrowski, and he shows that a specific hope-based pattern of thinking prevailed at the beginning of the 80s. And it was carrying the message that transformation as the abolition of anti-order brings order in itself, because it simply restores it. The image of order was mainly important from the West, which was stressed even yesterday, and it was implemented uncritically. I mean, with no regard to political, historical, and cultural differences or symbolic constructions of collective identity. It was based on the illusory conviction that in all countries of the Soviet bloc, after it collapsed, that free market economy would guarantee success, and all undertakings based on its rights would help it. The public discourse transformation was presented primarily as a collective process of change, associated with the emergence of new creative possibilities and with unveiling previously stifled potentials of one's own initiative and entrepreneurship. Certainly, for many people, the sequences of events in life were of such kinds, but for dozens, that period was associated with the experience of disorder and suffering. As shown by numerous empirical data in the form of the autobiographical narrative interviews, that's the method I use, individual biographical processes intervening in different configurations and with different strength of experiences of political, social, and cultural reality often led to a sense of disorder, chaos of values, of interpretation schemes, of orientation systems. For dozens of people, it was, if we recall Emil Durkheim's reflections on economic suicides, the crisis situations understood as disturbance of balance, which appears always when there are major changes in society, regardless of whether they are caused by a sudden increase or unexpected cataclysm. Well, so the orientation structures change. The values that had been underestimated and suppressed before, such as own initiative, competitiveness, economic success, or continuous development, become normative rules and constraints organizing social life. I would like to refer to another scholar coming from my university, Marek Czyżewski, and he showed that there was some sort of economizing rhetoric and economizing legitimations which were very important in the public discourse. They spread to all fields of social activity, including family, school, education, whatever you want, in fact, and almost sanctified being entrepreneurial, creative, and resilient. The routine methods of conduct known up to that time proved to be unreliable, the horizons of expectations vague, the mechanism governing the world of everyday life unobvious, in fact. This led to growing and encompassing new areas of social life anomie, which meant chaotic social processes associated with deep cracks in the world of values and expectations. In sum, this was the period in which a sudden social change shook or seriously destroyed the existing symbolic universum, allowing for giving sense to everyday reality and thus outlined the framework conditions for the emergence of collective and individual trajectory processes. By trajectory, I mean processes of chaos and self-alienation. A meticulous and rigorous analysis of narrative interviews gathered as a part of the project I mentioned before basically verified many binary schematic images and allowed us to capture paradoxes, tensions, ambivalences, and biographical traps which often result from a more or less conscious inability to deal with the expectations which contemporary people face. They can hardly meet the requirements mainly articulated in the form of ubiquitous discourse of agency and self-responsibility. For my presentations among 3 cohorts under study, I have chosen the one born in the 80s. This is said, the generation or the cohort is said to grow up in free Poland and to have their entire conscious life fully in conditions of democracy and liberal economy, which allegedly makes them the first full beneficiaries of systematic and political changes in Poland. But it is hardly ever mentioned that they enter the adolescence period and later labor market in a social-cultural context framed by the dynamics of interrelated processes of political transformation, vibrant modernization, globalization, and development of new liberal ideology. They have been oftentimes connected with the feeling of biographical trap and the experience of precarious balance of everyday life. That is a consequence of belonging to intensely multiplying social words, and social words I understand after Adel Clark and Anselm Strauss. I'll come to it later. Well, so let me now focus on the case. So I'm going to focus on the case which is anonymized as Julia, or Julia if you wish. Julia's biographical experiences constitute an extremely interesting case of the collision of expected and propagated in family pedagogues, curricula, or public discourse, attitudes and life orientations which change dramatically along with the process of political transformation in Poland. Her autobiographical account is not a story, but the path. It's not a story about the path to success, but about continuous efforts to maintain, mentioned already, precarious balance of everyday life, and to deal with excluding logics of different social words, as well as the constant necessity to suspend her own biographical plans. All these contradictions and tensions are seen in the renderings of many people born in the 80s, which are non-linear, incoherent, emotionally overloaded, and full of fading out phenomena. We can read her biography as follows, and you can see it on the slide, in fact. Despite very unfavorable starting conditions, she managed to succeed. Thus, Julia's case may be interpreted as a strong orientation on improving social position thanks to the education and the possibility structures offered by a capitalist market economy. It would be, however, only a partially and probably superficial way of understanding her biographical development, since her success story is based on many sacrifices that are not visible at the first sight. I will present them as a certain buts that disclaim or even question her achievements. So, she was born in a big family and poor family, living in a small town situated around 200 kilometers southeast of Warsaw. Her primary school experiences were difficult because of rather strained relationships with her peer group that contributed to the sense of inferiority, lack of recognition, and a sense of isolation. It might have had something in common with the negative image of her family in the local community. In secondary school, she finally found a group of friendly people with whom she shared interest in rock music and liked, with mutuality, to spend her free time with them. She still went to music school, and she was active in volunteering, where she looked after elderly people. Since she was 17, she spent weekends, holidays, and days off working at a guest house. She found this job herself, and she was constantly busy. Returning to the period of Julia's high school, we must mention two important issues that affected her whole life. First, she went through difficult experience with her boyfriend, future husband, who suffered from major depressive disorder, was emotionally unstable, and had suicide attempts. Secondly, she was diagnosed with diabetes. Since then, that disease has controlled her life, although at the level of her at face value presentation, she was trying to prove that she is able to monitor it successfully. But whenever the narrator disregarded the constraints imposed by the disease and lost herself in stressful and manifold activities, she ended up in hospital in a rather poor condition, as she says. She does not notice and she does not associate these two facts with each other. Instead, she claims that the disease increased her ability in self-discipline, resourcefulness, and resilience, or last but not least, awareness of the need to bear biographical costs and optimize the attitude to herself. She chooses to study political sciences not because of a substantive content of the university's curriculum, but because she was a member of some sort of the youth authorities in her region, and political studies graduates were its leaders. She was fascinated with a cool way of running trainings and workshops by them. It might have been a consequence of Julia's social origin. Although her mother completed extramural studies after the birth of her first child, and both she and her husband supported the education of their children, they certainly lacked the insight in the field of the academy. According to her parents' view, studying was first of all supposed to raise the professional qualifications translated into life stability and better material situation, and only secondly, if at all, to widen cognitive horizons, provide intellectual and moral development, and things like that. But, again, she chose not to study at Warsaw University, thinking that it would be too difficult for her, and enrolled at another university in Warsaw. This may be a proof of her lack of self-confidence. And again, but political science did not fully meet her expectations, and after the second year of studies, she decided to apply for sociology, this time at Warsaw University. Finally, she decided to undertake doctoral studies in political science, which she considered humiliating and withdrawing in development. I'm quoting her. Julia, like thousands of doctoral students in Poland, had to work to be able to maintain herself. She carried out commissioned research, conducted various types of trainings and workshops, was a research project evaluator at the Warsaw University of Technology, had a small position at the University of Warsaw. In the summer, she left for Germany to work as a carer of elderly people, but only in primary school near Warsaw, where she worked for 1/3 of the full-time teacher of social studies. She had an employment contract. She was able to earn a living in the capital city, which is also important, could purchase a flat without a bank loan, but, again, for a long time she was living in a dormitory. Her financial situation was very unstable, and the organization of these scattered jobs and additional involvements were often exhausting. It took a form of a trap set by overwhelming external structural forces and the systemic experience of precarious balance of everyday life, which is very characteristic of her experience. Well, Julia, a political scientist and sociologist, has unconsciously or maybe consciously become an expert oriented to producing disciplined and even self-disciplining subordinates. I'm quoting Scott here. Her work was about producing creative individuals capable of managing themselves and their time, controlling stress, working in a team, writing and evaluating projects. There is a very clear biographical irony here. Being a zealous propagator of some new liberal attitudes and values, she herself fell victim to this form of exercising power. I think I should change it. Many Julia experiences bear the trajectory traits, so I mean very connected with suffering and disorder. Being overwhelmed by many diverse professional duties, chronic instability and uncertainty of the current life situation, feeling of pressure from employers and dependence of their goodwill, or finally the necessity of suspension her life plans, especially motherhood. Her education acquired at expense of hard work, for which she paid with lack of acceptance, at least at the elementary school level, and many sacrifices that does not translate into the expected social status, prestige, or, last but not least, financial profit. The promise of stabilization becomes an illusion. The biographical scheme of a narrator works is constantly being suspended, which leads her to abandoning biographical work. If she consciously takes it up, it would be a threat to the ominous truth and could confirm that every year it becomes more and more complicated or even unrealistic. Biographical structures in the current life situation do not guarantee a fully positive development of the biography and are in fact a trap threatening the autonomous development of her identity. Julia's biography reveals many features typical of modern complex society that are consequence of entanglement of individuals into numerous social words. Not only are these words constantly growing, but they become more and more fluid. Thus, nowadays, people not only have to deal with various, often contradictory styles, logic of behaviors, and moral standards of social words to which they belong, but also with the dynamics of internal changes and disputes regarding the authenticity of core activities in each of them. In addition, all of them requiring specific knowledge resources, creating their own weak culture and awareness, create a sense of moral commitment to achieve common goals and oblige to loyalty. It seems that this process intensifies significantly among people born in the 80s of the last century, in the life histories dominated by the sense of confusion, tension, disorientation, and irritation caused by cacophony of logic, moral orientation, standards and ways of organizing work, criteria for assessing undertaking actions, ideologies, values of obligations, characteristic of different social words. Actually, Julia's story shows growing uncertainty and confusion resulting from overwhelming arrangement of various social words, in fact. So, last sentence, in fact. The analysis of a large corpus of autobiographical interviews with people born in the 80s, which are called sometimes the first full beneficiaries, shows that their lives mean usually wrecked professional careers, interweaving many various temporal jobs, lives filled with uncertainty and anxiety. Paradoxically, they are accused of not being entrepreneuring enough or involved in making democratic society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I thank all three speakers for being in time. And so we have nice 30 minutes for discussion. So maybe I'll take the liberty to ask my own questions for any speaker, and then there will be time for audience. So maybe for Katarzyna Vanek, it will be more about your method, but you have to understand that my question is from another discipline, so I'm a historian and so on, but still, you focused especially on your heroine biography, Julia, and so in many aspects, her life and her self-understanding somehow corresponds with the approach and conclusions of great sociologists and so on, so they confirm itself mutually. But on the other hand, so just one biography, is it enough to generalize? So wouldn't it be quite easy to find completely different biographies and completely different self-interpretations? So how can we work with this? So for Gazela, Pudar, so nothing very original. So you spoke about the role of intellectuals in post-communist transformation in Serbia, but so what about the other countries of former Yugoslavia? So is the situation the same, Slovenia, Croatia, Kosovo, or very different? So very briefly. And for Veronika, Pehe. So of course this is, I think, very interesting and very important, this very different case of private memories and public memory of the 90s, and this is really the mainstream of mass media and so on, that 90s were really something really terrible and so on. You have explained it and so on, but where did it come from? Why is such a difference in private memory and in public memory of what happened 20 or 25 years ago? So my opinion is, among other things, because this very critical approach to what was going on during the 90s and this first period of post-communist transformation was instrument and part of a very sharp political struggle during the 90s. So Miloš Zeman orchestrated the campaign before elections of 1996 of Social Democratic Party, and it based especially on this interpretation of what was going on. Anyone has stolen anything and burned country and so on. Even Václav Havel and his famous speech, Rudolfian speech by the end of 97 at the concert hall in Prague, Rudolfinum, was a little bit softer, but still very critical and used the same arguments when assessing the previous 5 or 6 years and so on. So do your respondents also incorporate this experience that this very critical approach appeared already during the 90s and was yeah, so my 3 questions. I ask for brief answers and then the audience. Yes, please.
So, well, one case is not enough, but I think that if we generalize too much, we also lose something in our analysis. And I think that it's sometimes it's worth focusing on one case to show a variant or a mode of experience in more detail in order to be aware that if we are looking for common denominators, we lose something, and the reality is blurred, in fact. But of course, I'm saying that one case is not enough, and I have to admit very shortly that my dream is to write a book about, let's say, 400 pages about analysis of one case, and I will prove that it is worth doing.
Okay, thank you.
I cannot say with certainty because this is not what I actually researched, but I could say that in Serbia it was a little bit different from other countries because except Franjo Tuđman, who was president of Croatia, who was also intellectual, coming from this intellectual field, everybody else actually were coming from other fields, political, usual political elites, ordinary political elites. Only in Serbia it was really the case that after the Milosevic and his elite, which was pre-socialist elite, emerged from that period, they were all coming from these intellectual circles. So the main opposition parties were led by the people who were scientists or writers. I mean, Vuk Drašković, who was one of the biggest leaders during the 90s, not so more prominent today, he was actually the very famous writer. So, I mean, in Serbia, these intellectual circles were leading also influencing political field very much, and obviously, this was a little bit the case also in Croatia because we had, during the 80s, we had a famous memorandum of Serbian Academy, which was actually highly disputed as a document who introduced nationalist discourse and helped Milosevic to shape his program. And it was something similar also coming from Croatia, but not on that level and not with that influence, I could say, from the moment. In other countries, no, really, this was not the case.
Okay, thank you. So maybe use the microphone if you want to say something. So
yeah, I know. I'm not so familiar. I'm not so familiar with the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I know that he has some group of Massimo Bosniak intellectuals who were working with him very much, but I cannot say. I know, for example, that one of the person who was very much prominent at that period, Eyüp Ganić, is now a rector of one university. So maybe it was a reverse process, but I cannot say with certainty.
Okay, thank you. And
yes, thank you for this question. So about the discrepancy between these positive private memories and the critical public discourse, where does it come from? Well, I would say it has to do with kind of wider political and social developments. This group of respondents is very much part of the liberal elite in the sense that many of them not only became business people, but also held positions in the media or were politicians on either regional or national level. So they were very much the ones also producing the discourse about the transformation in the 1990s and kind of cheerleading the solutions that were presented for the economic transformation. But what we're seeing now, 30 years on, and this is something that's been going on for the past few years, is a kind of generational and political change, in the sense that the media is experiencing a generational change. Increasingly, people in their 30s, so kind of the generation that Katarzyna was talking about, have more critical perspectives on the 1990s, because perhaps this promise of being the main beneficiaries kind of didn't materialize to such an extent. And also, obviously, on the political level, well, not only in the Czech Republic, but everywhere, we're generally witnessing a kind of backlash against these liberal elites and new political forces, often of a populist nature, trying to blame the kind of failures of the transformation on these liberals. So that's just kind of the general framework. But in terms of these particular narrators, whether they realized that already in the 90s there were these prominent political actors who were critical, well, not so much. They would mention it if asked directly in the second interview. In the first interview, where they just kind of narrated freely, it didn't come up so much. And the reason is that many of them also very much have this period associated with intensely personal memories. So many of the respondents pointed out that this was a time when they met their partners, got married, their first children were born, they graduated from university, and so on. So obviously the 1990s are also very much colored by these kind of personal rather than political milestones for them. And for that reason, this kind of very prominent rhetorical strategy was really to say, I was kind of aware that these things were going on in the background and that people were critical, but it wasn't what I was focusing on.
Great, thank you. So I propose now to collect the first three questions from the audience, the gentleman behind and there.
Okay, Bartłomiej Sztan, Polish Academy of Sciences. So I've got a comment and question to Katarzyna. So first of all, thank you very much for this really splendid description of the experience of the generation born in the 80s. Actually, my first comment it's about the categories which you're using to describe the generation, because you're mostly referring to irony and uncertainty, and now I'm speaking out of the generation experience more than the actually based on some research and stuff. But very often I'm observing that what is appearing is complete lack of agency, lack of possibility to influence the socio-political and political social and economic situation. So I would like to ask you, based on this example which you use, or further from the cohort, you are observing some kind of repeating idea of lack of agency, and because of that uncertainty which is coming after that. And the second question is connected with the results which are coming from this economic uncertainty, because I got the feeling that actually the lack of will to deeper participate in the political processes nowadays in Poland is very much depend on this uncertainty caused by the lack of agency within the neoliberal economic system which the cohort born in the late 80s and the beginning of 90s is in. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I saw another hand over there. And over there, and then don't forget your question.
Thank you. Andrzej Pamisiak. I have a question to Veronika Pehe. I would like to know what is the social legitimacy of these groups you were talking about. In some of the post-socialist countries, there is the narrative that to become a successful businessman after 1989, you had to have this social, economic, and so on capitals, and who could have them? Of course, former communists. You know, it's a kind of a narrative. So I would like to know to what extent is the case of elites you were talking about, or maybe there are kind of counter-examples of this in Czech Republic, or maybe it's not the case at all in Czech Republic. And another question, I would like to know what made them economic elites? I can imagine, as you said, that they could become politicians or media elites. And did you able to trace why they became economic capitalist elites? And it's maybe not the question, it's just a quick comment to what Katarina Vanek showed. I agree that some deeper studies and more cases might be a good way. However, I would like to say, as a member of this cohort, that from my personal perspective, it's a fantastic idea to look at this group and their experiences, and to some extent, the case you gave us is quite close to my personal, and I would say many of my friends' personal experiences. So I think the idea is brilliant, and it's just a short little story. Yesterday, guided by some local Warsaw citizens, we went to some pub, and there was the statement on the wall that I can promise you that I will promise you some perspectives. And it might be a funny statement, but it might be also a good example that there is something which should be studied, and there is, yeah. So I really like your presentation. Thank you.
So please, the third one from that corner, and then. Yes. Yeah. So I mean, gentleman over there. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Till Hilmer. I have two questions for Veronika. The first is, where are they? So I'm interested in your respondents. Do they generalize this narrative of individual effort? Do they think that others also had those opportunities? Was there, in their view, equality of opportunity after 1989? Because I think that's an important distinction for how they make sense of this time. And then I'm really fascinated by this longitudinal perspective. And for instance, you could ask whether knowledge about rising social inequality in the Czech Republic actually enters these personal stories, and you could try to figure out how these narratives maybe they're narratives about the transformation, maybe not, but it's actually possible to ask a lot of very interesting questions with this longitudinal material. But I only have one specific one, which is, do people already in the late 90s, I didn't get a sense whether you looked at this material as closely, but do people already have this very strong sense that they have to create a moral story for themselves of the transformation time in the late 90s, or is that something more recent? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So one more question for the first round, and maybe. Okay, so don't forget about you.
Okay, thank you, Adam Rozowicki. Thank you for 3 presentations. I have more general question which concerns all 3 presentations which we heard. So the question is about changing perspectives of social scientists on issues which we talk about. So we have not only generational change taking place among our informants, but also generational change taking place among ourselves. And I think it has an influence on how we see the reality, because honestly speaking, I haven't heard from the people who were the key figures in the 90s in Polish sociological field too many times that we are deeply wrong, yes, in interpreting this change. So I heard it from some people, but it's rare. So, for instance, this whole transitology paradigm, or talking about Homo Sovieticus, learned helplessness, talking about working class as socialist Frankenstein. These are really the quotes from the leading figures of the Polish sociology. And now we have something else going on. We have different kind of interpretations, and I would like to comment. I would like you to comment on this change in the perspective of yourself on the data which you study. So the role of your own way of interpreting reality, in interpreting those narrative accounts which you are collecting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I would now propose to our panelists to have a possibility to answer those questions, and there will be another round for your questions. So let's start with Katarzyna. And this.
Thank you very much. And I would like to say, first of all, that, of course, I'm very happy that you like my perspective, but it's not my perspective. I'm working with a team, and part of this team is sitting next to you, Jacek Burski and Asia Wygnańska, and we just work, let's say, collectively, because we discuss all of the issues. So, and we are working on the generation of the 80s as well. I would like to generally answer the whole questions which were addressed to me. I think we must be very careful, because all these individual experiences are usually framed somehow by a social or public discourse, and in my understanding and the method I follow, they not only take from the discourse, or not only the discourse defines the way of understanding themselves, but also their behavior or their way of defining the discourse influences the very discourse. And I would say that there is a subtle difference, and I don't know if I'm able to show it now, but there is a subtle difference between being creative, innovative, resilience. There is a difference between being about this agency, right? But if it is my own inner way of acting, or it is something which is expected, and I wanted to show, analyzing the case, that it might be, in some cases, it might be the way of living which is very illusionary. Right? And it's not my idea to be creative, but I am expected from the very beginning of my education even to be creative. If you take educational curricula into account, young people are taught how to be creative, for instance, all the time. They have to become entrepreneurs of themselves all the time. So maybe I'll stop here.
Please, Gazela, the last question was also for you.
Yeah. Well, yes, you're completely right about the change of perspective. And I remember, let's say 5-7 years ago, my colleagues were not even considering to take some topics from the socialist period as an object of research. And today some of them are singing partisan songs. I mean, so that obviously there is a change. I tend to think of myself as kind of lucky in this perspective, because I was studying sociology, and sociology in Belgrade University at least was always leftist place. So we never had such a negative discourse about socialist period as it was dominant maybe in some other circles and in the general public at some perspective, although it was not always the case, because this socialist nostalgia was always present in Serbia very much, so it's a little bit different. But when it comes to the social scientists, I would say that in the, let's say, past 4 or 5 years, we clearly see the change of the focus, and we are opening much more the issues from the socialist period, and we are trying actually to figure out how this heritage which we have, which is a little bit different from other countries of post-socialist transformation, so this self-management and everything was in which way it can help us to build the different parts of democratic change, because we are obviously facing with the democratic decline, and this maybe can help us to induce the agency among the citizens, actually, which is something which we are lacking. And I think this is the focus of the social scientists at this moment in Serbia, and I can say that I am part of this wave, and I think it's valuable for our country to do it like that.
Okay, thank you for all these questions. I'll maybe try to somehow group them together. The social position of this group, Andrzej's question, and whether there's this also narrative about business elites being connected to the former communist elites in the Czech Republic. Well, yes, this narrative certainly exists. Our current prime minister is perhaps a good example as somebody who kind of started his career in the communist foreign trade branch and then kind of used his contacts to build a huge business empire in the 1990s 1990s becoming one of the wealthiest Czechs. But this particular group is an exception, or not an exception, but simply kind of, they were extremely lucky to be positioned in such a way that they were not, they didn't have time to become morally compromised in the past, right? So like they were too young for lustration to apply to them because, often they were 20, 22 years old in 1989. And they didn't have this baggage from the past. And they were also kind of, not only did they have the kind of social and cultural capital that came from their university studies, but also a kind of moral capital that they earned in the revolutionary activities, right? Like they were, to an extent, seen as heroes in the early 1990s. And certainly some of them liked to kind of feed this image of themselves even more. But what made them economic elites, maybe I wasn't clear. I mean, these aren't necessarily economic elites, right? These aren't necessarily people who are kind of, who hold economic power in the country. I mean, they are successful business people in some cases, but they're really kind of more social and cultural elites in the sense that they've kind of, they have influence on public discourse. So maybe that's just to kind of be more precise. Do they generalize the narrative of individualism of the 1990s? Yes, absolutely. I mean, one thing that came up so many times in these interviews was the respondents saying, we're living in the best of possible worlds and I don't understand what all these other people are complaining about. Yeah, so they completely have this kind of totally complacent perspective. I would say that their social empathy is quite limited in this way, but we did ask them about their parents, for instance, and then in that kind of question, they would say, well, actually, yes, that is a generation that hasn't had it as easy as us. So they are kind of capable, obviously, of some kind of self-reflexivity and realize that, other social groups didn't have as convenient a starting position as they did. And the longitudinal perspective, yeah, it's obviously fascinating because there are so many things that can be compared. Do they create a moral story already in the 1990s? So this is a bit difficult to assess because actually the interviews in the 1990s didn't focus on the 1990s so much. They were much more focused on the actual events of '89, and whatever the respondents said about the 90s was kind of more as an aside rather than kind of purposefully. So I haven't traced anything like that in those interviews, but it's also probably because of the interview design. So it's hard to answer. It would be really interesting, but yeah, unfortunately. And just, Adam's question about the kind of our own role in interpreting, maybe this isn't exactly what you were asking, but it got me thinking about one thing that I think is also very interesting about this project and certainly plays a role in interpreting this data, is that our team was also multi-generational. And obviously we're dealing with the question of generations because we're focusing on this particular generation of '89. And the principal investigator, Professor Miroslav Waniek, he conducted the research also 20 years ago, and he's slightly older than most of the respondents, but more or less shares a kind of similar life experience with them. While most of the team members, there were 10 of us, were in their 30s. So, the age of the children of some of the narrators are just slightly older than their children. And certainly that played a role because we found out during the project when collecting these interviews that actually Professor Waniek's interviews were different to ours. Because not only kind of was there much more implicit understanding going on, much more kind of assumption on the part of the narrators that the interviewer shares their worldview, but also they were just kind of much more colloquial, and in the sense that the interviewees felt like, well, I don't have to explain about the 90s to you because you were there. You experienced the same thing. While when they were talking to me or to one of my colleagues, they were like, oh, in the 1990s, you don't remember that, but this is how it was. So it actually produced some really interesting results, and we had to kind of do a lot of self-reflection in our team on how we work with this material in terms of these differences.
Okay, thank you. So now I think we still have 5, maybe 10 minutes time for the second and last round of interventions from the audience. So I do remember the gentleman over there, the lady over there. Yeah, so 3 more questions. Okay, let's start with he raised his hands, maybe the first one. So.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for the panel. It's very, very stimulating in the morning. I have a question for Katarzyna. I was curious about this biographical research. If you see or if you look at like the ways of or like forms of actually this self-narration, and like beyond this particular example, and like do you see, for instance, in the way people speak about themselves, this generation is somewhat, like, let's say, different from the way people spoke like in 1980s or 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, like this, the communist state was also so much keen on its biographical practices of the self-narration, biogram, and like all the rest of it, right? This self-improvement and so on and so forth. So like, do you see any sort of resonations or any echoes or like differences, like the complete, like something else? I mean, just came to my mind, might be interesting. I have also a question about this category of political capitalism. This, goes around, I mean, like since yesterday too, and not just yesterday, but this is like, there are so many elaborate theses about that. Jadwiga Stanishkis is like one of them, and so on and so forth. And sometimes I wonder, like, when capitalism is actually not political. You see what I mean? It is sometimes like assumes too much, a lot of separation between the economic and the political. Okay, it captures this collusion of the market forces, the economic forces, and the political class, if you want to put it that way. But so like what might be like the other ways of actually like the seeing or like capturing that process of this, class formation or the state formation, right? This beyond this political capitalism. Sometimes it's sort of like the obscures. I can say the same thing for, Turkey or for India, and in Poland too. You have a similar kind of, like tendencies. I also have a question for Veronika. It is, you said that at some point one of your interlocutors said that we didn't know the word transparency before. And now, this may be a kind of like a moment of also this type of self-reflection too, like in terms of how they see this legality or illegality, or like what is available and what is not. And I was also like curious about, like when you think about the social movements or the student strikes in general in Turkey, but there was also a discussion like the Occupy movement in the United States, in New York. Like, when do they produce this creative class? When do they accumulate all this capital? Which one will be used for them to become entrepreneurs of some kind too? Like when a certain movement kind of gets installed or stops short, then it eventually turns into something else. Or you can think of like similar examples, Turkey 68ers, which kind of produced great entrepreneurs out of that student movements. Like the slogans were really, really radical, but in 1970s, 1980s, it was a very, very different story, like their career trajectories in general. Like so I wondered, like what part of it also is about, I mean, like the kind of ideas that they have, their intellectual formation in 1980s, like what they actually wanted, and then this, let's say, the structure of the conjuncture that sort of determines their paths, their life paths, and give a form or transform them in a way.
Yes, so please over there, and please, because of the lack of time, I would prefer questions than comments. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes, thank you. I have 2 questions to Katarzyna as well. Well, just following up on Saygun comparative question, I wanted to ask you, well, to defend what is actually Eastern Central European in the story, in the life story you present. So, is it specifically Eastern European transformation which is in behind her biography, or is it specificity rather of the neoliberal capitalism and as experienced by this generation more globally? So, we could have similar story perhaps for Greece, Portugal, other peripheral capitalism, and with the people with more or less the same experiences. So if you see some, patterns which are really local or some which are more global. And the second question is, how does the experience of this generation differ from other generation you studied? Okay, to make it brief.
Okay, and now the last question over there.
My name is Piotr Szanek, and I have a question also for Katarzyna Vanek. And I think why your research on the generation of the 80s may find resonance also globally or throughout Europe, not only in the Eastern Europe, and why it found resonance on this in this audience. Is for one thing because it's an extremely numerous generation in comparison to the millennials, for instance, right? The other thing is I think it's understudied, and I think also that this generation, also answering maybe a bit your question, is sharply distinct from the experience of people who are 40, 45 and entered adult life around 1989, right? For one thing, it's the second wave of after the baby boom, right? So it's extremely numerous demographical wave throughout Europe and USA even, because of the Second World War, and that translates to, I found that surprisingly not obvious for many people who are older or younger. It was a quite unique experience of a very sharp selection from the very young age until, well, throughout your biographical, career. Educational and labor career, because well, you had always to get in Warsaw or in other big cities to a fairly decent high school. There was always 7 to 10 people, for one place, and then on the university the same. And then when you were entering the labor market, it was the same thing. But you also met there 40-year-olds who, with knowing a little English and having finished high school, could become in a few years director of a new branch of international corporation started in Warsaw, right? So I would say it's fairly similar in other peripheria, and of course there's also this experience of still being somehow feeling situated in this poverty and glumness and underdevelopment and terrible infrastructure, terrible schools and so on that were inherited in the 80s after late communism. And then seeing, well, this modern, let's say, turbo-European, transformation now. And I also witnessed time and again that for the 40-year-olds, the narrative of success is so easy to pick up because well their life histories were a bit maybe easier out of those sharp structural reasons. And of course for the millennials, they don't remember the hardcore of late communism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. The organizers asked me to try to inspire dynamic discussion, but instead of that I have to stop the dynamic discussion, but time is running, sorry for that. So the last word, especially Katarzyna, but also to other panelists.
Yeah, I should be very brief, so if you would like to ask me questions, please do it after, because, never mind, I don't want to be the only one. So I would like to answer only one question, which was yours, because it partly also answers Joanna's questions. The way of narrating, yeah? I had the opportunity to work in another project, which was interviewing people born in East Germany and Poland in the 40s, 50s. So as you can see, the project I'm referring to is a continuation. And I think if we take into account narration, and I usually take narration, argumentation, and description into account, I believe that they are very much different if we analyze the generation born in the 80s. I was mentioning it's more unlinear. It's very chaotic sometimes. If we take narration into account, there are many moves back and forth. So the first impression is that it's extremely unordered, for instance, right? And we do not why. And if we take into account the method I'm using, the autobiographical narrative interview, it says that the narration illustrates the way of experiencing things. So to put it in a very simple form, it means that their life is really much more chaotic and disordered, right? So I think this is the main reason. And maybe the question of Joanna concerning specific features of Eastern European transformation. Again, I would say that I participated in another project and I was working on European identity, and there are interviews with people who were born in the 80s in the Western countries, and their narration is slightly different. I think they are, in many cases, they try to be very critical and are sick of new liberal identity, and they try to escape it, while people in Eastern Europe still at least trapped in this illusionary reality that it is the only way, right? So thank you.
Well, I will be very brief. Yes, political capitalism. Capitalism always political. Maybe it would be better for me to use the term chronic capitalism, which is very similar actually to this. But I just wanted to emphasize this. This is not a feature of Serbia only, of course. I wanted to emphasize this characteristic of this relation between business and the political elites, which are actually using all administrative regulations, laws and bylaws in order to secure profits for the chosen ones, for those who are actually cooperating with political elites. It doesn't matter coming from domestic or foreign surroundings. So this is what I wanted actually to emphasize here. I know all the possible critics, but I don't have another better term for this moment to use.
Okay. Thanks. I would say that, the examples of student movements you mentioned, Saygun, are slightly different in the sense that they tend to be more left-wing, while in this case, these were people who weren't left-wing. They were what they wanted. Well, they wanted the end of communism. They didn't at that point really know much more about what specifically they wanted, but they basically wanted the opposite, and that turned out to be very right-wing, neoliberal ways of thinking. So in fact, this trajectory, is from student revolutionaries to entrepreneurs is kind of very logical in this way, and not a paradox, maybe like in some other student movements. And in terms of the self-reflection, those are the most interesting moments for me in these interviews. They didn't come up very frequently, but in a few cases they did. And a few of these interviewees, usually people who are in some kind of public position, who realize this, that they say, well, in this kind of euphoria of the 1990s, we forgot about the social dimension of the transformation. That's a mistake that we made. And so, that's something that did come up. That they would say, like, in the 90s, I thought it was just the free market and that's it. But now I see that other things are also necessary for a functioning society. But of those 100 people, maybe 5 of them said that.
Okay, so thank you very much, especially our 3 panelists, but also the audience. And now there is time for the morning coffee we all deserve, I guess. We have something like 20 minutes for coffee break, yes, and then we'll be back for the other part of the program. Thank you again.
Thank you.